Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran. Today we'll be taking a look at the Death Knight Covenant abilities. Everything available for Death Knights to choose from their own covenants come Shadowlands. I could test out majority of these covenant abilities, and I made a list together compiling which ones I liked, which ones I didn't. Spoiler, I didn't really hate any of them, but if I had to rank them from my most favorite to least favorite, I had to put something in last place and something in first place. But Death Knight overall with Covenant abilities is looking strong and quite exciting. You got some actual meaningful choices and really cool possibilities. So let's take a look at some of the Covenant abilities coming for Death Knights, available at least currently this early alpha, and this all might change in the future, as what Death Knights have to play with right now, at least in the Tower of Torghast. The first ability for Death Knights you'll be taking a look at is going to be the Kyrian ability called Shackle the Unworthy. It's a 1 minute cooldown, but it is very deceptive. It is definitely not a 1 minute cooldown. Essentially, you put up a dot on an enemy, an extra dot that doesn't replace any of the other dots, and it does arcane damage. Does quite a bit of damage on top of it, makes the enemy do 5% less damage to you. The caveat about this, every rune that you spend while this dot is up reduces the cooldown of this ability. So while it looks like it has a 1 minute cooldown, it could be down to what, 20 seconds if you are really fast at cycling through your runes. So this ability is a dot that's going to be available with you as you're fighting the boss or whatever enemy may be in PvP. Should be available at all times unless you're somehow able to put up the dot but unable to generate runes afterwards. It also should be said that you don't have to generate and spend those runes on the same person with that dot. Just by throwing that dot out there, you throw it into the ether, and while it's up from the time that it starts, you have a limited time to spend as many runes as possible. Even this dot, let's say, kills a target and falls off very quickly, you still can get it back faster just by spending runes into enemies. So the game kind of gives you like this internal clock as soon as it's been thrown out at somebody, that you have a limited time to just spam runes as fast as you can. So this ability actually have a very short cooldown. For a single target boss fight, I could definitely see for Death Knight it being quite value. Hell, for Blood DK, that's a 5% extra damage reduction, especially good for any casters, for example, that do magic damage, and most tanks aren't really great at dealing with caster damage. For PvP, this makes that one single enemy that you decide to focus down, makes them do less damage to you. It's a very simple ability, but it has a very short cooldown. It adds a little bit extra single target damage to the Death Knight. It's a very simple ability, not more can be said about it. Death Knights also have an ability to summon a steward, which will give you the ability to change talents, thank your friends, as well as have a vial, which will take away poisons, curses, bleeds, everything but magic damage, which you can cover with AMS. So this ability is actually quite good for Death Knights, particularly good in PvP, and can be great in dungeons for a little bit extra survivability. Not a bad combo of abilities whatsoever if you decide to play Kyrian for your Death Knight. Next ability we'll be taking a look at, and this one is one of my more favorites, is the Necrolord abilities. With the Necrolord, you gain the ability of Abomination Limb. What it does is it grows an extra limb on your character. Right now that limb looks like a tentacle, but maybe in the future it'll be like an extra ghoul limb, like a ghoul arm or something. And that'll be something really cool for Blizzard to add in the future. And you also have this green smoke around you when you activate this ability. While this ability is up, every few seconds it'll do shadow damage to nearby enemies. And it will select a target that's far away from you that it can reach, and it'll group them to you. So every 2 seconds you have this ability that will keep yoinking enemies back to you. In a single target situation, that means one single enemy will be picked out of a bunch, and as they're running away from you, the ability will keep gripping them back in over and over, which can be amazing in PvP. In PvE, it allows Death Knight, whether you're a tank or any kind of Death Knight, to have a little bit extra mobility to yoink enemies into the group. Especially if they're casters from afar, this ability will be a nice disruptor and can be used with, let's say, Death Knight running circles around someone, with this ability constantly gripping them, cheesing some of the casts. This ability does also quite a bit of damage overall. It's really cool looking, and for Necrolords, it's a very interesting mechanic that plays with this constant grip, which I personally am a huge fan of. The second ability you get from Necrolords is called a Fleshcraft. It's a shield that you will use to apply a shield every 2 minutes to yourself. If you use the shield around other corpses, especially if it's powerful enemies, such as, let's say, elites or bosses, then that shield will grow stronger in power. It's a shield that makes a tanky class even tankier, and I'm a huge fan of something like this overall for the Death Knight. I think overall, if you go Necrolords for DK, it seems like a really interesting combo with great potential for AoE as well as single target. Great for PvP or PvE, For a kind of a long cooldown ability, both the Fleshcraft as well as the little extra ghoulish armor that you get for yourself, both of the abilities will be great for any type of content if you choose to play Death Knight as a Necrolord. Third ability on the list, and probably one of the cooler ones for a majority of the Covenants because of its red appeal, is the Venthyr Covenant abilities. For Death Knights, you get a Mist Swarm, which is a 1-minute cooldown, so it's a fairly short ability. What it does is it surrounds the character with a mist that does shadow damage to enemies over time, and it also grants you 10% dodge while this ability is up. Great against physical damage, not super great against, let's say, caster damage. While this ability is up, every time it deals damage, it generates you runic power up to a maximum of 15, so it's not like it can generate you too much runic power, but the extra that it generates for you is quite nice. It can be used for Death Knights in order to give themselves Frost Strike, more, let's say, Death Coils or Death Strikes if you're Blood DK, or in PvP has massive use for the extra Death Strikes that it will provide. It's a very simple ability. It's not like the Abomination's Limb for Necrolord, it just does shadow damage. It does quite a lot of shadow damage, which can be used for single target as well as AoE. The resource generation is what I really like about this ability, which means that it can be used for pure AoE, but it can also be successfully used in single target as well for those extra resources. If, let's say, there's a fight, maybe in the future in Mythic Pluses or in raids, where there's some physical damage going out, that 10% extra dodge could be nice. And in PvP, it'll be great against classes like Rogues or Warriors or any other melee class. It doesn't really help with casters. The second ability available for Death Knights, however, is one of the coolest. It is Doorway to Shadows from the Venthyr Covenant. It will teleport your character forward to a desired location with a very short cast, allowing Death Knights incredible amount of mobility. And personally, I'm a huge fan of that. Death Knight is a class that struggles with mobility, so being able to reposition yourself very quickly with a little bit of a cast time to it, does kind of signal to enemies in PvP or PvE that hey, you're about to move, but with strategic planning, you could definitely cut off an enemy or move out of a bad situation before things really start to heat up. And for Death Knights, mobility overall I think is a massive, very undervalued skill that they simply cannot have from talents. They don't really have an efficient way of going for it, and mobility can save you from bad situations or help you close the gap even further. I'm a huge fan of that aspect of the Covenant. Now the last ability for the Fae, I actually had to use some footage from YouTube. I'll have the channels linked down below, and I'll try not to use too much of the footage, just enough to show off the ability. Death's Doom. This ability is supposed to be available after the Venthyr ability, but for some reason for Death Knights today it cycled back to the Necrolord, so I'm not really sure why it did that. Either way, Death's Doom drops down a modified Death and Decay that is going to have a little bit of this blue look to it. It does shadow damage over 10 seconds, and enemies that stand inside of it slowly start to have their strength sapped, doing less and less damage to the Death Knight the longer they stay in it, up to a maximum of 15%. The Death Knight will also gain strength based on how much strength has been sapped from enemies, so you'll be able to actually gain a strength buff up to 15% maximum. If you are, let's say, a Unholy Death Knight, you will still also have the cleave capabilities of the Death's Due ability, so that's going to be nice for any kind of cleave capability. Now when you think about it, it's an ability that replaces your Deaths and Decay, so let's break it down how it affects each spec. For Blood Death Knight, it's a massive buff. It's more damage for your Death and Decay, which you use quite often, since you still have procs in order to drop down random Death and Decays. A Death and Decay is a great ability part of your AoE rotation. The fact that it saps strength from enemies will just make you overall tankier. Enemies are going to do less damage to you, you'll gain strength, becoming more effective as a tank, so this overall seems like an incredible value for a Blood DK. For an Unholy DK, Death and Decay in certain builds can be used for pure single target. So with a specific talent, you actually can use this ability quite often. Again, more value for Unholy Death Knight as well with the strength buff and the cleave capability. Even if you are a Frost Death Knight, you're not really going to use Death and Decay that much. However, with this Covenant ability, you might want to start saving runes and start spending them on this ability. It does mean that you have to kind of keep enemies in the same area. And yes, you're not going to have the cleave capabilities unless Blizzard makes some changes about the playstyle of how Frost interacts with Death and Decay in the future. But right now there's no cleave on abilities while standing inside of Death and Decay. Even without the cleave, you still will gain a massive strength buff, reducing the damage enemies do to you, doing a bit of shadow damage on top of it, which does not scale with any mastery or any other buffs. But still, the extra strength, which already you have a bunch of buffs to overlap your strength together, will grant you quite a bit of damage. It's an ability that only costs 1 rune and can be used every 30 seconds, and it should be able to line up with a variety of different abilities quite often. So for Frost Death Knight is definitely something worth considering. In PvP, of course, everybody's going to run out of this ability immediately, so you're not going to get that much value from it. But if an enemy, let's say, wants to drop down the DK, dropping this ability down and holding your ground will eventually make the enemy do less damage to you and will increase your strength. Enemies will want to have to get out of it, so if you're playing defensive as a Death Knight, this ability is not the worst. It also can be used in a sense to zone enemies, and with your grips and stuns, you can kind of force enemies into the area as well, so it could have some uses. Overall, I'd say I actually kind of like this ability of what it can offer you for PvE. For PvP, it might have some uses, but I do think that this value is actually pretty quite high if you're a Blood DK or an Holy DK, since you use Death and Decay quite often throughout the fight. And this is a pretty nice modification to the ability. Now, it might be a little too early to decide which one of these abilities I like the most, but this is going to be my list so far. Spoiler, I don't hate any of these abilities. There are some I think are more interesting and some that are less boring. Let's start with a more boring one, because usually let's talk about the ones that I like the most. The Kyrian ability is very simple. It's a single target ability, and I wish it had more to it for, let's say, possibility to spread it to others. So I think it could be more competitive with the other abilities since they're more AoE focused. But I'd say the Kyrian ability is probably the simplest. It might even be the best one for pure single target damage, but it's just kind of lame and simple compared to the others. I like the cooldown reduction that it has to it, but it's really easy to play around and it's not super intricate. The Swarm would be my second least, but not really bad ability whatsoever. I actually like the Swarm a lot. I think the extra runic power it generates for you and the damage it does can be good for single target or AoE, and the dodge could be really nice from a Blood DK perspective. But I just think that the dodge aspect doesn't really help deal with the casters. My second favorite ability would have to be the Necrolord one. The ability to grip enemies from afar and doing quite a bit of AoE damage is always enjoyable. I like the idea behind it and the disruption potential that it may have for a Death Knight. If you ever want to be annoying like a rogue, as a Death Knight just grow an extra limb that'll just keep gripping that healer back to you over and over, what are they going to do? Run away? They can't. So it's going to be a nice lockdown ability with some potential for PvE purposes. And finally, I would say that the Fey Covenant ability is my favorite one for the Death Knight. I like the fact that it just has so much value for the playstyle that already exists for Blood and Unholy, and potential that it could create for Frost. It's actually a simple ability that replaces a single ability that you use quite often as a Death Knight, at least with 2 specs. And with Frost, you might actually start using this ability quite often as well. The value that it has to make enemies do up to 15% less damage to you on Blood is insane. It actually can also be really good for Unholy as well as Frost, especially when it comes to surviving boss mechanics, or just simply doing more damage. And for PvP, it could have some potential, but that's not really one thing that I've been looking at from these abilities, is really considering them in PvP. But even in PvP, I still feel like it could have some play makes to it, maybe potential in the future. But these are the abilities that are ranked and how I like them for most, at least. None of the Death Knight's abilities are bad, and even it feels bad in my stomach to put Kyrian ability as the least liked, because I really do like it. It's one of the better Covenant abilities in general, and I can think of a couple other classes and specs, even Rogue, with some of the Covenant abilities that are even more useless than the Kyrian Death Knight ability. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Let me know which of the Death Knight Covenant abilities was your favorite to maybe use in the future, and which one of the Covenants are you thinking is going to be the best for Death Knights when it comes to the gameplay. Remember, we haven't seen the passives of some of the soul binds, so there's still plenty of stuff for us to test, but out of the stuff we have in this early alpha, which one did you like the most? Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys all in another video.